I never expected to find this amp so useful, but two of the features in there just really nails it for me. And spoiler alert, it's not really about the sound, but I still use it very often. Now, as you may know, my main setup is the Fractal Audio FM3. I love the sound and it's very easy to work with when I'm playing live, if I'm in the studio or creating videos for YouTube or an online course. It sounds amazing, feels great, and it can do pretty much anything that you can imagine. But the amp that I'm talking about in this video is not like that at all, and I would never have dreamed of buying an amp like this, even if it's only $100, because how can that be any good? And I did actually get it as a gift, but I'll tell that story in a bit. And let me just also point out that this is not a sponsored video. Now, it didn't occur to me how practical it is. It adds a different category of amps for me that I never really thought existed or imagined that I would find useful. And to some degree, this is of course quite specific to how I use it, and it may be different for you. But you can let me know about that in the comments along the way. You're probably going to be surprised at how good it sounds when I compare it to the Fractal. That's coming up as well. In 2023, I was lucky enough to get invited to perform as a guest soloist with Nick Javier and his band at the Taichung Jazz Festival in Taiwan. Now, I've known Nick for decades. We studied together at the conservatory and played in some of the same bands back then. It was amazing to get to go there and visit him and his family, and also to get to play a concert for more than 20,000 people. That was pretty mind-blowing. That's a bit larger than the average jazz club, at least around here. While I was there, I got to know a lot of new people, and one of them was the guitarist Nick's band, George, who's in fact also a YouTuber, and on the day of the concert we did a video together for his YouTube channel. I'll link to that in the video description. George gave me the amp that I'm talking about, which is this Newegg Mighty Light. Now, you're probably thinking the same as I did when I saw it. That's a cheap practice amp. That's not going to sound great. What am I going to do with that? Obviously, that was a bit ungrateful of me to think like that, and I didn't say anything except thank you to George, but I was pretty skeptical about it. Later, I did try out the amp when I was back at my hotel. I figured out how to connect it to my iPad so that I could set up a sound and play around with it a bit, and it sounded a lot better than I thought it would. You'll hear later when I start comparing them. But I didn't really realize just how much I was gonna end up using this. Let me just quickly point out that Newegg did not sponsor this video or give me the amp. They also don't get to decide what I say in the video. In fact, they have no idea that I'm making it, even if I might send it to them. So what is this amp? Now, as you can tell, this is incredibly small. It's also incredibly light. I can pick it up and wave it around. It's $100, so it is all plastic. It's not a tube amp, if there was any doubt about that. It's essentially a modeling amp with a few effects and a very small speaker, which is maybe not great. It's not sort of the highest quality or the best sounding speaker. It kind of has the same as a cheap phone speaker, where it cuts through everything, and well, there's something to be said for that as well. The controls on the amp are very basic, but surprisingly practical, because they really just seem to hit just what I need when I'm using it. So you have gain, you have a master volume, tone, which is essentially the treble on the amp model, and then you can switch between the delay and the reverb here and adjust the level of it here. Now, there's also a drum loop that you can turn on. I've never used that. In fact, just get a metronome. You can connect phones or headphones, and there's also a line in if you want to add a backing track in some way. It's really meant as a practice amp. Now, you can also, let me see if I can open it, you can actually run it on batteries as well. As you can tell, I've never done that, because the other way to power it is with a standard 9-volt power supply, which is what I always bring when I'm using it. That's just a lot easier. As I said, it's a simple modeling amp, and you can connect it to a phone or an iPad through Bluetooth, and then that's how you design sounds and choose amps and effects, what I'll get back to later. And something that's actually incredibly important is that it has a USB-C connection. Now, I already said that I don't use this because it sounds amazing, so how does it sound? And later I'll also compare it to the Fractal Audio FM3. This sounds a lot better than I thought it would, and the way to create a sound with this is obviously not using the controls on top of the amp, but instead with the app. So you install the app and connect to it with Bluetooth. Now, it's pretty simple, and the app's interface is really easy to use. So let's check that out. So here you have the interface for the app. Let me just quickly show you how this works. It's fairly simple. You have the different presets up here. Then you can of course set the patch level, so just the overall level of the patch. You can see I've set it a little bit louder than 0. The main part of the sound is of course just the amp and the IR. So the amp, I guess you know what it is. The IR would be the speaker simulation. It's kind of like a detailed EQ, can be really useful to work with. Now in this case, if I just turn off this one, then I'm using the deluxe reverb amp. You can choose different amps like this. There are 20 something amps here. I'm just going with this one. My setup is fairly simple, so the gain is not too high. The master is kind of open. And then the EQ settings that I always work with, which is turning down the bass and the treble, and then boosting the mids. So that's also what I'm doing here. That sounds like this. But this is still a little bit thin. The way I chose to deal with that is to go into the overdrive pedals and then just find something like a tube screamer. In this case, it's a blues driver. I'm assuming that's like a Boss blues driver. Turning that on, and then I have the gain, so the overdrive set to 0 or low. The level is sort of whatever fits so that it doesn't overdrive the amp too much. And then I sort of adjust the tone. Usually these overdrive pedals like tube screamers and this blues driver will sort of boost the mids, and that makes it a more full sound. I'm sure you can hear the difference. That's really sort of the basic sound. Now the IR, you can actually also choose different things here, and you have quite a large amount of speakers that you can use. If you're not used to thinking like this, actually the speaker is much more important for the sound of an amp than the amp itself. Now in this case I actually just took the default speaker and didn't really look at this. One thing that I did notice now, which I didn't realize before, is that it looks a little bit like you might be able to upload your own IRs, which would be kind of interesting because you can really do a lot with that. Now in this case I just took the deluxe reverb. I have a delay that I'm using, and that's quite soft of course, but that's really nice to have that. I really just use that to sort of emphasize the reverb a little bit, and then of course the reverb here. Now there's not a lot you can do with the delay and reverb settings. In this case, with the delay, I was really just looking at the different kinds that are there. I tried to find reverbs that are not too bright, and the other ones were just a lot brighter. And then you can see the level is kind of low. This is of course also one of the things that I can actually change while I'm playing, because on the amp there's a control for that. And then you have a sound like this. As I mentioned, then I made this patch back in 2023, and I haven't really changed anything after that. That's also how I work with my FM3. I don't really mess around with it unless there's something that's changed, like a firmware update or some other thing that I need to fix. For the rest, I just keep it really simple. Earlier in this video, I mentioned how the speaker of this amp is a little bit like a phone speaker, that it sort of barks and has a lot of mid-range that really cuts through, which in a way can be nice because it sort of compensates for the size. But, and I'm not sure I can really demonstrate this in the video, but I'm just gonna try with the different microphones that I have in the room and compare that to the recording of the amp. So you can probably hear how there's not a lot of bass coming out of the speaker. It's super small, but it still sort of cuts through, and it's actually kind of practical in some situations. I'm not using this amp when I'm performing. It's not really good enough for that. But there are two situations where I use this amp, and one is if I go hang out with a friend who also plays, and we just go there to jam some songs, and it's very casual, talking music and playing, and of course it's a place where there's no amp, so it would probably be a bass player or a piano player or horn player, because if it's a guitar player then usually there is an amp, I don't need to bring anything. Now this really fits in my guitar case. It's so easy to bring, and I can easily go by bike or take a train with it. Even my smallest amp, the AER, is much more of a hassle to bring, especially it's quite annoying if I want to bring it on a bike. And this could of course be one of those things that's different from place to place, because around here it's quite common that if you go visit people and hang out, then you're going by bike or you're taking public transport and you're not driving, mainly just because parking is super expensive and actually driving around here is not super practical. Now, if I'm driving, then I'll probably just bring a bigger amp, and likely the FM3. That's just as easy. When I use it in a situation like that, then I can just use it as an amp, so I don't really need to connect it to the iPad. I will probably bring the iPad, but I think I have yet to ever use it. I just turn on the amp and use it like that, and it will work just fine. Whatever I need to adjust in terms of the room or the reverb or the delay, I can do on the amp itself without any problems. That's why I think the controls on the amp are actually really well chosen. Another recommendation that I want to make is that if you never hang out with other musicians, just talk music and play some tunes together, you definitely should. It's a lot of fun, it's great for staying motivated, and you actually learn a lot from it as well. The other way that I use this amp is probably more important in terms of work, and it's likely that you've already heard recordings that are recorded with this amp. When I travel, and especially when I travel to Anaheim for NAMM, then I'm often shooting videos with other musicians, both jamming and also some lessons. You've probably seen the videos I did with Amy Nolte or the Rotem Sivan videos, and there's also one coming with Pritesh Valia. And here, this is where the USB connection on the amp becomes very important, because when I'm traveling, then it's difficult to bring an audio interface and also speakers to monitor when you're recording something, and when you're jamming, you want to have something that sounds like an amp and you want to hear yourself. Having this USB actually means that I have an audio interface with a speaker that I can use for monitoring what we're playing, and then I'm using this boss pedal to plug two guitars into the single input that this has. To compare the Newegg Mighty Light and the Fractal Audio FM3, then I kind of decided to turn off reverb and delay, mainly just because the reverb and delay in the Fractal are just so much better than what's in the Mighty Light that's not so interesting. But I do think it's interesting just how good the amp sounds when you're recording it through the USB. I think that's sort of the main takeaway here. So what I did was that I made a setup with the line selector so that I could just play, and then it would be going into both this and the Fractal at the same time, and then I can go back and forth. Let's listen to that. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that they actually sound quite similar, and the difference is not that big. But at the same time, the FM3 is fuller sounding. I really do think so. I think the mid-range just sounds better. Now, you could maybe tweak that a bit more. This is from memory, but I did a similar kind of video with the Boss Katana a few years ago, and I really have the impression that this sounds better than the Boss Katana. But that's just my opinion. You may not agree, and you can always leave a lot of angry comments down in the comment section. I do think that the FM3 sounds a lot better than the Newegg, but you also have to keep in mind that it's a lot more expensive. So you really do get a lot for your money with this. Is this something that you see yourself using as a practice amp? Would it be practical for you to be able to quickly just record yourself by plugging in the USB connection? Let me know about that in the comments. Digital amps is a polarizing topic on the internet, but I've actually been using modeling amps almost exclusively for 15 years now, and it's made my life so much easier, and it also made me sound a lot better in the room at concerts most of the time. Probably because I often had to work with sound engineers that had one concept of how a guitar was supposed to sound, and I just really don't like to sound like Nile Rodgers most of the time. But you can also check out that story in this video and read some of the angry comments, because if you play blues on a tube amp in your spare time, then it might make you furious. Go check it out, learn jazz, make music.